All right. I have one page. Got two-sided, but one page, so it really isn't super long. It's interesting because this verse verse 2 of chapter 6 here, carry each other's burdens or bear each other's burdens, some translations. It's like a really famous one, but I feel like I never remember the ones around it. And so I just wanted to spend some time like walking through what's happening in this little passage and noticing some of these other verses before we pause to share with each other and just be reintegrated into what's going on in each other's lives if we aren't caught up right now. I will just read the passage first, and then we'll start talking about it. I'm starting back in chapter 5 because I think it should be a part of this section, not split. Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking, and envying each other. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. If anyone thinks they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else, for each one should carry their own load. So, starting from bear one another's burdens, and in this manner you will fulfill the law of Christ, it actually pulls us back into the section right before this that Jeff went over last week, where Paul describes, before he starts listing the fruits of the Spirit and the works of the flesh, he starts off by saying, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, reflecting back on everything else in this book we've learned about already, like this freedom from the Mosaic law that Paul is bringing them to. He says, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love, for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command, love your neighbor as yourself, which is this verse 2 right here. If you bite and devour each other, watch out or you will be destroyed by each other. So I say, live by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. So then he goes on to list those fruits of the Spirit and then the works of the flesh, which I think when I read, I usually think of them as like, these fruits of the Spirit are supposed to be internal, individual things that I'm doing myself, and I don't necessarily think of them as activities that are happening in community. Does that make sense? But if you think about it, they really are really closely connected to our community. So this whole section is about Paul talking about how to relate to each other, and the fruits of the Spirit and the works of the flesh are in context of that. If you look at them, you realize, like, you can argue that impurity only affects you, maybe. It's just like in your mind and you aren't doing anything else. But like hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, and envy all literally require someone else to be the object of your hatred or discord or whatever, right? It's all about how we relate to each other, and that's what most sins are, is us not relating well to each other. So the point one is that life in the Spirit that we're being called to, instead of life underneath the Mosaic law, is by nature communal, and we should be thinking about how it impacts our relationships with others. And in fact, I would argue that the best evidence that we are living in the Spirit is found in our relationships to other people, not in just like what's in our brains and what we're thinking about. So connecting these. Since we live by the Spirit, keep in step with the Spirit is directly related to when you do that, we will carry each other's burdens and fulfill the law of Christ, which is to love our neighbor as ourselves. The new law, like, and he's doing something tricky here. He's just spent this whole book saying, like, the law doesn't matter. Stop circumcising yourselves. You don't need to worry about the law. And now he's like, but you need to fulfill the law of Christ. A new concept. You're not free of moral obligation, but it's a new one. It's a different kind. All right, so that's that part. That seemed easy to me. The rest of this is kind of interesting, and I noticed that there are some themes here, so I did some color text things to point point out some sections where he's kind of like saying the same thing a couple times, and I think all of this passage sort of ties together nicely if you notice it. So the first is he's in the negative saying, don't do this, which is don't be basically proud. So don't be conceited, provoking and envying each other. Provoking it, I think that, or annoying would be another word that fits pretty well, and I thought that was funny, because like, that seems like, why would that be bad, but it does happen that way, right? We annoy one another, we irritate one another when we are full of ourselves and proud. And then down here, he's kind of like looping back to that same concept, thinking if you are thinking they are something when they are not, or like thinking you are better than you are, you deceive yourselves. And don't do that. Instead, take pride in yourself alone. So it's fine to have pride, but it should be within reason, without comparing yourselves to someone else. I'm sure he's like doing this in response to some people he knows that he thinks are doing this, and probably this whole Judaizer, you need to be circumcised, you don't, had some elements of this in it that he's kind of speaking to, like these people who are trying to put themselves over others. But I think it's interesting. This is like the negative, the inverse of the bearing of burdens. And I don't know if I always think of that. I think of the negative of that as just being selfish, but that selfishness comes from a like inaccurate assessment of myself, which is part of what I think his point is here. When someone is conceited, they will have a difficult time relating well to other people, and they will become unable to do the task in verse 2 and verse 1 well. So that's one. There's kind of like this pride versus being humble. Then there's here this mix of like, we often use the terms like grace and truth juxtaposed next to each other, right? So he's saying when someone is caught in a sin, which doesn't necessarily mean by you, but just that they are found to be in sin or failure, we who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. So they're caught in sin, so there's like a holding them to truth, like saying, hey, this is wrong what you're doing. But then there's a call to be gracious about it and say, come, we can fix this, come to the right, once again, doing it gently. And then watch yourself, or you also may be tempted. There's also like a call, like, but if something's wrong, like that's still wrong, and you have to be careful not to fall into it yourself. But you can restore them. You still should be restoring them. So it's interesting. Like, I mean, we know this, but offering truth is actually a bigger burden than just helping someone out a lot of times, right? So like, I'm in community with you, and you're doing something wrong. So, but rather than isolating myself from that and just letting you do your thing, or isolating you from us so that I don't get tainted, I'm instead like intervening and attempting to help you correct that. And that's hard. This is like friends setting up an intervention to confront somebody with a substance use disorder, right? Like, that is way better friends than the ones who are just like, yeah, live your life, or I don't like that, so I'm just gonna cut them off. Which I think is the like normal human response. There's nothing fun about that, especially if it's done not because we're trying to be better than them or coming to them from a perspective of pridefulness, but from one of humility. This is what a community of Christians should be offering to each other. Truth that is rooted in, motivated by a common source, a common purpose. Which is interesting. When I preached last, a couple weeks ago, I brought up some of the like ways growing up in my church that like there's rules, but like I gave the example of the head coverings, but all these rules in church, and I kind of presented them as bad. And then Jace afterwards was talking to me and saying like, could those be done in a way that isn't bad? And I was like, yes, they could. Anyway, it's an interesting discussion because I think in our context, our tendency is away from holding each other to truth and like intervening and saying, hey, I think that that's not right and you should change. And instead, we are a lot more prone to be like, it's all right. Like, we'll just be friends. And without, like, those hard conversations, I think, are not in the nature of this church's, how the church functions. I'm actually fine with that. But I'm just calling us to that. Like, if we see something in each other that is not right, we should be telling them that in a spirit of gentleness. And then the next thing that's interesting here is something that Paul will continue to expound on in the next section, but there is this sort of contrast between the community that he's calling everyone to. I just spent a bunch of time saying like this spirit stuff is all about being in community, and that's how the relationships with others is what's really important. And so we should be caring for each other, so we should be carrying each other's burdens. But then down here he's saying also each one should be kind of like doing their own thing too. Like each one should test their own actions. Each one should carry their own load. So there's an interesting, like, he's saying carry each other's burdens and carry your own load. They're like next to each other. And I think it's important because this part of knowing what you're doing yourself is an important part of the humility you need to do the other part. So, like, me being aware of my own burdens, if in this sense, like, the burdens seem less to me of, like, help out with, my physical needs, loan me your car, those kinds of things. It seems more to be focused on help me with my failures and the way that I fall short of following Jesus. If I'm more aware of my own shortcomings and the way that I fall short in following Jesus, that allows me to not be conceited. Hold on. If I'm aware of my own shortcomings, that allows me to not be conceited when I'm interacting with others because I know my own spot. I know my own failures, and that when I see your failures, they are failures that I need to talk to you about, but I'm aware that I'm not perfect either. That helps me do that restoration part gently because I'm aware that like you should be telling me the same thing later when you notice my problem that shows up. And that changes the dynamic. That allows us to carry each other's burdens in a way that is actually about carrying each other's burdens, not calling out each other's failures to lift ourselves up higher. Interesting. It's a little bit of the like, take out the stick in your own eye before you call out someone else for their failures. So I think that's just the key to the passage, that Paul is calling us to individually take responsibility for our own actions before God and view our lives realistically in humility so that we can care for each other with grace. When I filled out the survey, which I did, by the way, only because he made the elder team do it before we did the beta version, so that's the only reason I got mine done. We won't talk about that. I'll talk to you about that later, gently. When I filled that out, and one of his questions is, what is your vision for the church in here? And Joel and I were talking about this too. Like, when you're like, oh man, if I write down what I want to happen, it feels a little, because I'm not totally sure I'm willing to do the work that I want, that needs to happen to make that thing happen. Does that make sense? Like when you're actually the one creating the vision for the church, it becomes a little more realistic. You're like, oh, that would mean everyone would have to be willing to do this, and I'm not sure I'm willing to be a part of, or I'm not willing to put in the work to do that. I think there can be parts of our own, okay, and then let me finish that thought before I move on. It made me realize, okay, some of the times that I'm kind of blaming church for like, if church was like this, that would really fix this thing. There are times that I have those thoughts, and it might be true sometimes, but it also might be true that I'm kind of wanting church to fix a thing that is actually a me thing. And like if I could fix my own approach to our church, that would actually be most of the problem, and then that would be helping move the church in the direction I actually want it to go. So, are there parts of your own spiritual journey that you want the church to fix that actually are you problems? And it applies in everywhere else. Like, are there things in your marriage that you're like, man, I wish that this was different, and if my partner would just do this, that would happen. When actually, like, there's things that you could be doing that would happen. Or maybe more broadly, like, there are times you wish God would fix this part of your life, and you've asked him, and you're frustrated he's not there for you, when really, when you step back, you realize that it might actually be like the ball's in your court and it's your turn to turn to him in that area, rather than the other way. Like, maybe that's a burden, your own load that you're acting like doesn't exist. So, these are the little themes. Here's some color coordination. We're called to live by the Spirit, avoiding pride and conceit that leads us to compare ourselves with others. And instead, we should be watching ourselves and taking responsibility for our own actions, being like humble and honest about our own limitations and failures, which then enables us to lift each other up in kindness with a sense of understanding rather than judgment only, since we recognize our own flawed state as well. And then through this process, we become a community that does carry each other's burdens, which is all we have to do. It fulfills the entire law of Christ. If you do that, all the other stuff falls into place. And that's what we're called to